Hello, I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Welcome to today's online event, Living the Climate Emergency, led by our climate fellow, Zainab Shuker. Here at Century International, we study some of the most pressing policy problems affecting the Middle East, and we try to identify usable solutions, usable policies, and analyses that can help affect the outcome of the crises. Our new line of work that Zainab is so ably leading is plumbing the depths of the climate crisis and is trying to make some kind of usable agenda out of this really daunting catastrophe that a lot of times creates a kind of paralysis in the policy community. Today's event culminates several months of work that Zainab has led, and what we're trying to do today is a first step in a long stream of work that tries to create a map forward for policymakers by getting into the real details of the crisis and the real details of plausible solutions. So I'm tremendously honored and excited to have hosted this work by Zainab and her team. And I will turn it over to her to talk about her project, Living the Climate Emergency, and today's panel. Thank you, Zainab, and your colleagues for your excellent work.
Thank you so much, Thanasi, for these remarks. Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab Shuker, and I am a fellow at Century International. I am also an assistant professor of sociology at Sam Houston State University. And like Thanasi said, I'm really excited to be here today. I'm really excited to kind of see that work that we've been working on for several months now, my research and the research of our panelists published, the papers have been up for a couple of days now, and I'm really excited to have everybody to kind of be here and chat about the climate crisis in Iraq and, hopefully think of solutions as well throughout this conversation. So everyone, please help me welcome our panelists. We have Maha Yassin, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Regional and International Studies. We have Hussam Sobhi, who's founder of Iraqi Green Observatory. We have Safa Khalaf, who is an Iraqi investigative journalist and independent researcher. And we have Max Helton, who is the executive director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies at the American University of Iraq in Suli. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to have you all here joining me today. And your papers are amazing. They've been out for a couple of days now. It was a pleasure to be part of the process and to read them. So Hussam, let me start with you. I think your paper is really fascinating because it is really telling us about the water crisis in Iraq, which is, when we think of climates in Iraq and the climate crisis in the country, water and water scarcity is sort of the first thing that comes to mind. So you are discussing a lot of the information that we know, but you are adding depth to it by giving us visual representation using data, using satellite images, and so on. One thing that really I found fascinating in the paper and important is that you mentioned in the past 4 years, water levels have declined significantly in many of the country's lakes and reservoirs. We know the water crisis has been going on. We know infrastructure has been a problem. But if you can tell us a little bit about why the past 4 years have been very critical, and if you can paint us a little bit of a picture of what water scarcity looks like in Iraq right now. Hussam?
Thank you, Zainab. Hello, everyone. This is Hussam Sobhi, a biologist and environmental activist from Iraq and the co-founder of the Iraqi Green Observatory. It's now widely recognized that Iraq is among the 5 nations grappling with the consequences of the climate change. This unfortunate reality has led to a notable rise in the rates of water surfaces evaporation, affecting bodies of water such as natural and artificial lakes, reservoirs, and marshlands. Oh, sorry. Annually, Iraq loses a substantial amount of water, surface water, estimated to be between 8 to 12 billion cubic meters. These challenges are exacerbated by a combination of domestic and foreign policies concerning the management of Iraq's water resources as well. On the international front, the construction of dams and large-scale projects in the upstream countries has significantly reduced the flow of water into Iraq. Notable projects include the Turkish GAB initiative, encompassing the construction of over 200 dams along the Tigris and the Euphrates River, as well as the Iranian dams built on the territories originating from Iranian territory. Domestically, successive Iraqi governments have struggled to implement effective water resources management strategies. The absence of a clear comprehensive plan for internal water management has further compounded the issue. Additionally, Iraqi negotiators have faced challenges in securing substantial water allocation from neighboring Turkey and Iran. Moreover, recent years have seen the emergence of numerous unauthorized and unsanctioned projects within the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resources. These ventures encompass unauthorized developments such as a widespread construction of fish ponds and unregulated expansion of agricultural lands through all of Iraq. The undertaking place significant strain on the Iraqis' water reserves, which have witnessed a sustainable growth over the past 4 years. The Ministry of Water Resources often overlooks many of these projects, primarily due to the association with the armored factions in Iraq. Consequently, these initiatives are rapidly depleting Iraqis' critical water reserves, as they remain beyond the purview of privatization and oversight by the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resources. Thank you, Zainab. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you so much, Hussam. That was really important to know, and it really highlights sort of the weakness of the Iraqi state. And I feel like that's going to be a theme. I saw that theme in the papers, and I think that's a theme that will come up throughout this panel, which is, you know, the fragmentation of the Iraqi state, the weakness of the Iraqi state, non-state actors really undermining sort of the Iraq's ability to respond to the climate crisis and increase environmental degradation. Mac, let me move to you. So your paper, I think, is really important to really highlight an angle that is, you know, the average Iraqi is dealing with, the health aspect, right? The Iraqis on the ground are experiencing, you know, climate crisis specifically through health and health crises and risks. And so your paper, you really expand on this concept of, you know, environmental degradation, climate change, beyond just the person and the individual, and really incorporate the ecosystem into the conversation. It's not just the impact on one, it's the impact of many, and then that come back and impact, you know, climate change and environmental degradation. So if you can tell us a little bit about what are some of the limitations? I mean, Hussam highlighted some of them in terms of, in general, the Iraqi state and its fragmentation, but what are some of the limitations within Iraq that makes Iraq specifically vulnerable to the climate crisis, specifically in relation to health risk and health issues?
Thank you, Zainab. And my name is Max Skelton. I've been told to give a description of my physical surroundings, and I'm in an office surrounded by glass, and I'm wearing a blue and white shirt, and I have a new haircut, so hopefully it's looking okay. So I'm going to take this question. I'm glad that Hussam gave that overview, because I am going to take this question about the linkage, I guess, between state fragility, climate change, and health through the lens of water supply and water pollution, just because it sort of condenses the focus a bit. So repeating a little bit of what Hussam said, in Iraq, you have decreased water flow, especially in the southern provinces, due to a number of factors, most of which have nothing to do with climate change. So you have less water coming from Turkey and Iran to the north. You have water infrastructure within Iraq that's become deteriorated over years of war, corruption, and many other things. Hussam went over this, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. But the point is, none of these political and governance realities have a lot to do with climate change. You could make an argument that there's some connection, but it's not the main thing. But on top of those issues, increasingly you have a situation in Iraq where Iraq has witnessed successive years of drought, higher temperatures, increased evaporation. And so this, of course, plays a role in reducing water supply. So it's not a stretch to say that climate change is a factor in this. And of course, it will become more so the case in years to come. And so this is where the health side comes in relation to water supply. Decreased water flow means typically that you have higher concentrations of sewage and industrial pollutants in the water supply. And on top of that, Iraq's water treatment facilities typically cannot process these adequately. And sort of the health linkage there is that contaminated water is associated with a range of conditions such as cholera, gastrointestinal diseases, skin diseases, diarrhea, and even certain cancers. So to sum that up, the linkage here between water scarcity, water pollution, and poor health outcomes is actually quite direct, and there's a good amount of evidence base for that linkage. And it will likely only continue to get worse as the forces of climate change gain steam.
Thank you so much, Mac. Yeah, it's very dire situation. I mean, we've seen that happening on the ground. We saw that in Basra, for example, with very toxic environment that eventually led to protesting on the ground and so on. So Safa, that actually bring me to your paper specifically, because you talk about conflict and you specifically talk about collective violence. So we know that climate change alone, research shows that climate change alone does not generate conflict. It comes to a place where there's already existing structural limitations, there's already problems on the ground, and increases the odds of conflict in a place. And again, we have been seeing that in different places in Iraq. But you introduce a concept that's called collective violence, and I thought that's really interesting. If you can tell us a little bit, what is collective violence? What does that look like? And when we think of Iraq and we think of collective violence and the climate crisis, how does that manifest on the ground? What does collective violence look like on the ground in Iraq?
Thank you, Zainab. Actually, the collective violence is not a community of water, and it's greatly affected by climate change and sorts to developing its interesting and access to water through armed violent means. Where conflicts are between members of small agricultural communities, such as tribes, lands, and farmers who resist government measures on the one hand, and on the other hand, they engage each other in continuous cycle of violence in order to own large share of water in these areas. We have now a lot of evidence of mass violence, which has led to an increase in tribal fighting in the mid and the southern in Iraq especially. And for example, we can define 3 types of fights over the water in the mid and south of Iraq. And the first one, fighting the tribes and farmers who lands lay on the border of the emirate or in the border of the cities, as the eighth in the Oman land between the Al-Musanna and Al-Iwaniya emirate or the emirate. The second one, tribal rates on an Asian water is an option. Point and a small dam that shares or that operation of pumping water to land. This rifle and farmers, they attack. This is Mortars and attack. This is arrows in the south and mid of Iraq. The third thing is another rifle fighting between the members of the tribe themselves, whose agricultural land lies side by side. Therefore, the surface water shortage is still to be the main source to ultimate of armed conflict between the farmers. However, we have also we also have about 14 different types of collective violence water shortage in Iraq, which differ from one agent to another. But the most permanent of which are of violence directed at the state and the employees in charge of controlling water share. So collective violence related to water is more dangerous than until sectarian violence in Iraq, because the reason for this issue is continuous of violence and anything day after day to do that harsh climate effects. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Safa. That's really important, because like in your paper, you mentioned that you're probably going to see more instances of collective violence, 2025 and beyond, as water shortage become worse over time. So you're saying that collective violence comes in different forms: farmers with each other, tribes competing over land and water. So it seems to be land and water is the main source that individuals are fighting over. So farmer and farmer, tribe and tribe, and then state and farmer or citizen, right? So the state itself, and specifically on the local level, we are seeing folks who control water, access and so on. They kind of weaponize that with farmers, with tribes and so on. So we're seeing probably collective violence more on the local level. It seems to be very obvious, and that's going to worsen over time. And we saw with sort of Hussam's, paper and answer, the water crisis is worsening as we speak, and it's going to continue to worsen if no solutions are introduced. Thank you, Safa, for this answer. So Maha, let me move to you, because we know that it's a dire situation. We know the state is fragmented. We know we need solution because collective violence, because health risks are increasing with time. And one of the solutions is activism, right? Civil society representing one source of these solutions, but you highlight that, that is not happening on the ground. You specifically tell us about, or you define for us, climate activism as all organized and grassroots civil efforts to address the impact of environmental degradation and climate change on the ground. And you specifically let us know that these efforts are limited. They exist, but they are limited. You also kind of highlight that there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of struggle happening on the ground. So I was wondering if you can at least give us a little bit of a picture of what is climate activism, what actually exists on the ground in Iraq, and specifically if you can connect that to us to activism in general in Iraq. We know that civil society and activists in general, political and otherwise, are experiencing a lot of threat. We know the civil society is fragmented. We know that fragmentation is a reflection of the pre-2003 era, that weakness is a reflection of that legacy. And then new political actors came to add a new layer of fragmentation and threat to activists on the ground. So where does environmental civil society fit into these already existing limitations, and what actually exists on the ground?
Yes, thank you, Zainab. Maha Yassin speaking. I'm sitting in a room with white walls, and there is a monstera behind me. look like she's struggling, but she'll be fine. And I'm wearing a royal blue t-shirt. Environmental activism, as you mentioned, Zainab, when I say environmental activism in Iraq, I refer to the organized registered NGOs in Iraq, but also the grassroots campaigns and individuals who work in this sphere, who mostly focus on raising awareness or greening campaigns, let's say. In total, there is 185 environmental NGO in Iraq, and with this number, you would imagine that their impact is big in Iraq, but in fact, only few of them managed to establish a name for themselves and a work in Iraq locally and internationally. And this is, of course, due to several reasons, including structural and political. And with the structural limitations, I mean the capacity that is underdeveloped, and also the limit of the funds they receive from the government or also internationally, that has severely affected their impact on the ground to basically respond to the climate and environmental degradation problem that is already getting bigger in Iraq. And this kind of a problem, of course, as I said, limited their reach and impact, but they also limited their ability to provide meaningful response and contribution. So in this case, they resort to focus on, as I said, raising awareness through available and free tools, for example, social media. And of course, raising awareness is important given the impact of climate change in the country. But also, I believe that Iraq has passed this phase a long time ago. It is the time for action. And when it comes to action, the environmental NGOs are very limited with their reach and impact on the ground. And one of the limitations, of course, besides the structural one, is the political limitation. And this is due to the sort of relation between environmental NGOs and the state and non-state actors, but who actually threaten their existence and work in Iraq. But I will go in details on this topic a bit later.
Maha, that's really important. Let me follow up on this a little bit. So are you seeing activism or awareness among the average individual, right? So we know that they know there is climate change and they're experiencing the consequences of climate change, whether it's health, whether it's conflict over water, whether it's, incredible heat and the electricity is not there and the generator is not working. So they are, or see specifically during the summer months. What is the average person interested in activism? Are they interested in joining these groups? Are they organizing in any way? What kind of organization is happening beyond these the NGOs and the civil society? What do we see within the average person?
So what I see is that there is an increased interest in addressing these issues. There is like a more awareness that is growing among the people, and this is of course a good sign. And this is mostly you see among the young group that trying to do something on the ground. But when it comes to the political groups, the decision makers, the policy makers, you see less interest in this issue. Sometimes they even view it as a luxury problem. And this is why it's always like these groups of people are marginalized and not taken serious when they are talking about the issue or the impact of climate change on the ground.
Thank you so much, Maha. That was really frustrating because again we are seeing this problem and like you're mentioning, we are beyond just raising awareness. We need to be at the action stage, and we're not even close to that really in many aspects. Hussam, let me go back to you on your paper on water scarcity and water issues. So recently, I saw images and I wrote a paper, an article about activism in the Marshland. The Marshland is probably one of these places where sort of the worst of the climate change impacts is happening. It's very visible and we're seeing it. And there's also a lot of activism emerging from that region because the whole way of life is being undermined, right? People depend on the land, depend on animals, depend on the waterways to survive, and all of that is disappearing. And so this is really the worst of the worst, right? It's just whole communities are being displaced and impacted, and their livelihood is impacted. And, you speak of water scarcity, and when we think of the marshland post-2003, it was one of these success stories. Effort to restore the marshland happened. It was considered sort of an environmental success, the ability to restore the ecosystem, and people came back to the land, and there were tourism and all of that. And then since these successful efforts, we start seeing this steady decline of everything that's been done. And one can argue that we are heading, if not we're already there, into a situation that is worse than the pre-2003 sort of level of destruction of the land. So if you can tell us a little bit about what happened, why these efforts, all that progress that has been made has been reversed, and the land and the marshland, specifically in the communities there, are experiencing some of the worst sort of impact and manifestation of climate change and environmental degradation.
Thank you, Zainab. So this is Sam Subhi again. As you see, I'm sitting in my apartment. I'm surrounded by 4 walls without any furniture and stuff, because I don't like to put furniture around me. Actually, the Iraqi marshlands endured neglect by the previous government prior to 2003, compounded by a deliberate action such as intentional drying and water diversion. However, even after 2003, successive governments adopt a specific policies aimed to revitalizing the critical region, yet regrettably, none of these policies were actually effectively implemented. In the recent years, the stark influences in climate patterns have exacerbated the situation we witness today, marked by a significant increase in evaporation rates within the region. Furthermore, the government has failed to establish a comprehensive strategies for preserving the water levels in this area, ensuring adequate water resources to sustain its ecosystem and biological diversity. Despite the significant milestone of the marshlands being included in the World Heritage List in 2016, symbolizing a positive development, the situation on the ground has remained largely unchanged. Water allocation have not been increased anymore, and the residents of this area have been sadly neglected, resulting in the loss of their traditional ways of life, and also they forced to migration of countless individuals. Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you, Hussam. That could just again remind me of this idea of collective violence, right? So the state, we know these communities have been, oppressed for a very long time, have been discriminated against for a very long time, and water has been used as a weapon against these communities for a while. So again, when we think of collective violence and water use and water as a weapon, we can see the legacy continues even with efforts to address some of that collapse of the ecosystem that we see in pre-2003, and sort of the aftermath continue to exist. So Safa, I wanted to ask you, because we're talking about collective violence and we're talking about the marshland, and a lot of the focus tend to be on rural communities, right? So we know how collective violence look like in the marshland. We know you gave us multiple examples of how farmers, tribal groups, etc., compete over water and land, and collective violence tend to emerge in these communities because, again, the way of life and the economic system revolve around water and land. But I want us to think also about urban centers. I want us to think about places like Basra, like Baghdad. We've seen in Basra a little bit how that violence can emerge with health issues and water issues and so on. But I want us to think about cities like Baghdad, how collective violence will manifest in these places? Are we seeing that happening? Are these cities still a little bit protected from that collective violence because of the nature of the economic system in these cities? Can you tell us how climate and collective violence will manifest on urban centers in Iraq?
Yeah, Zainab, this is me, Safa Khalif again. Actually, urban communities also suffer from the water shortage because of the population density is greater in the cities compared to the countryside. And the intensity of vulnerability, the water shortage seem more evident as many urban sites witnesses now of waters in the local governments, especially in the Iraq, in the middle of Iraq and southern Asia. But unfortunately, maybe in Baghdad, urban areas, I think Baghdad has better water flows than the rest of the southern Iraq cities. But I think the real problem is in the remote societies such as Al-Musanna or Iraniya or Rafa or Niqab or Maysan or Basra. And to some extent in Urbana and Najaf, because the economy of the communities in these cities depend on agriculture, and the majority of farmers inform armed tribes. So the possibility of armed violence is increased because of the water is higher than in Baghdad or North region in Iraq. And also, we can mention some incidents. We can refer to the security environment observed in Basra in 2018 as urban communities, which was to the rate of population of water as more than 1,000 or more than 200,000 people there were poisoned. And also in March, in the last March, 2023, in the slash incident in the witnesses a violent protest to the rate of water, which tells the people to take control of government in water and export the government forces for support. And I think also in that areas we don't have many evidence that the middle of Baghdad is suffering from lack of water, but we have many evidence about as referred to we have some conflict in the port of Baghdad, especially in the north and in the south. But this is conflict, this is violence limit or limit violence is also related to the sectarian violence, because the Islamists in the north of Baghdad suffer from the government measure that try to use the waste of water in this area, and also in the south of Baghdad suffer from the lack of some water because the lives in the north of Baghdad is right to get of water from the other rest of Iraq. I think in Baghdad we have unrest situation now about the water, but I think the worst situation is currently in the west, in the middle, and in the west Iraq. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Safa. I think you bring up something that's really important, is that oftentimes when you talk about the climate crisis in Iraq, we talk about Iraq, but Iraq it's multiple regions, and it's not, the crisis does not manifest on the ground similarly in all of Iraq, right? So places like northern Iraq, for example, Kurdistan region, they're closer to water resources. The weather is better, so they're slightly more protected than some of the challenges those in southern Iraq are experiencing. When I think of you mentioned how the economy, specifically the economy of these rural areas, play a very significant role into, increasing chances of violence in these communities because they don't have alternative sources of income. So really the whole dependency is on water and land. And once that's disappearing, that leads to a problem of violence, but also leads to a problem of displacement. And, when I think of how urban centers can be impacted, I think we see displacement of rural centers to these urban places, to these cities, competition over resources, competition over employment. I'm sure, because I'm sure you know of this, in places like Al-Basra, for example, there is this constant back and forth between those who live in the city and those who came to the city, those who were displaced into the city. So you find politicians, you find local citizens who complain about those who are coming from outside Basra, who don't share the culture, who have different kind of behaviors, culture, so on, and they are competing. They keep saying they're taking away our jobs. They're competing with us over also limited resources, whether it's electricity, whether it's employment, and so on. Al-Basra, for example, is one of the cities that have highest level of employment, highest level of poverty. And so now there is this population pressure. And so we are seeing it in many ways. Often we think of rural areas, but really cities, specifically in the South, are struggling with that. And, specifically with the decline of employment and the increase in population, probably you're going to see more and more. As you're predicting, you're saying that collective violence is likely to increase with time as water decline and as the situation worsens. Thank you, Safa. So, Mac, let me move to you and go back to the health angle. In your paper, you introduced something I haven't heard of before. So I'm really excited to kind of have you define it for us a little bit and tell us more about it, which is the concept or the policy of One Health. One Health is a policy, and you mentioned that it requires collaboration between different agencies within the state, requires some state capacity to respond or to implement One Health. And based on everything we've been saying so far, the Iraqi state is not equipped to handle, any kind of complicated policy. They can't, there is very limited state capacity and fragmentation in the decision-making process. So how something as One Health can first be defined, and how can it be implemented in the case of Iraq, considering the limitation of the state?
Yeah, thanks. So this is Mac again. So the short answer, Zainab, is that I am not 100% sure how One Health can be applied. And there needs to be a lot of thinking and research before we can understand how any global health concept aligns with conditions in Iraq. But I think there's a good case to be made for it. So One Health is a term that's become popularized in public health circles over the last decade. And it's out of recognition that a lot of diseases, particularly infectious diseases, spread due to interactions between animals, plants, and humans. So that might sound complicated, but really all it means is that when animals and plants are impacted by diseases, often this affects humans and vice versa. So in Iraq, you really can't avoid this, especially with all of these kind of, distorted water ecologies, which have waterborne illnesses and water scarcity issues. And so, every week you'll see a story in the local Iraqi press about how water pollution has led to mass fish die-offs, water buffalo deaths, intestinal ailments for humans. And so One Health, the idea is that all of these should sort of be seen together. These multi-species health issues, especially in an era of environmental degradation and climate change, have to be kind of viewed together. You have to have public health approaches that attend to this interconnectedness. But yes, as you said, Zainab, these kinds of public health approaches are rather fine-tuned, and for them to function and to function well, ideally you have government institutions with the relevant jurisdictions that are collaborating, sharing information, doing joint investigations where there's overlapping competencies. So, you would need the veterinary department in the Ministry of Agriculture, let's say, which probably has the best sense of what's happening with water buffaloes and fisheries and what have you. They need to be communicating with the Ministry of Health, which is monitoring, pathogens that typically impact humans, because both of them are interrelated and impacting each other. So, what can be done in a place like Iraq? Yes, the Iraqi political arena is fragmented. Ministries are impacted by this fragmentation, but there's a lot that can be done at the level of networks of scientists that are spread across these ministries. When we say the state is weak, we can't generalize. A lot of Iraqi ministries have extremely competent and well-qualified scientists and practitioners who often just don't have the resources, the support, and the connections with other ministries to do joint programs. So what I would like to do in partnership with a lot of Iraqi universities, but also my own university, which is based in Suleimania, is work on strengthening some of these networks. And I think there can be an interconnection between scientists and government ministries and in Iraqi universities. But that, obviously that would be a small step forward. But I think because science is so reliant, One Health approaches are reliant on good science, and science is reliant on good interdisciplinary collaboration. That kind of work can be meaningful.
Thank you so much, Mike. Actually, there's a question in the chat from Dana Sadiq, who is, she asking, how can we help? What do you need, especially of conducting more research and raising people awareness? So I think that kind of fits with what you're saying. What can Iraqi universities, what can scientists do in terms of, contributing to finding solutions for the climate crisis? Mac?
So there's a lot that can be done. I think at the level of Iraqi universities, we need especially the more powerful, institutions like University of Baghdad, University of Basra, to be contributing to joint efforts to raise the kind of standard of interdisciplinary collaboration on these issues. These are, a place like AUIS, yes, we do, American University of Iraq and Suleimania, we can bring certain kinds of stakeholders together, but we're limited in other respects. University of Baghdad, University of Basra, these big, historic institutions of higher learning that do actually have many important researchers need to be involved as well. So what I would like to do is really work on expanding the network, and to the extent that there are researchers that are placed in different institutions across the country that want to collaborate with this, I'd be happy to be in touch.
And Matt, just a final follow-up, you also mentioned in your paper the role of the international community, and you highlighting how important they can be. We know sometimes the international community can do more harm in terms of sort of like throwing money at the problem, right? Just kind of giving people money and go do research or do awareness campaign, et cetera, often, or sometimes that money does not go to the right people. And then we're going to have an issue fatigue and just feeling of money being wasted. So considering, we just talked about research, networking, how can the international community and donors and funders kind of contribute to that, to these efforts?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, honestly, I think in many respects, there hasn't been any attention, any meaningful attention from the donor community to elevating scientific capacity in Iraq in the last 20 years. That's a bit of a bold statement, but I mean, so much of, if you just look at the way most, UN-funded programs work, USAID-funded programs work, they tend to target, they do capacity building that tends to be very quick and limited to sort of like a subgroup of professionals, but not focused on an institution and building a certain kind of institutional culture. And so at the end of it, you kind of say, okay, Kushimaku, there's nothing there at the end of it. And so I think what needs to be done is there needs to be, science is international. Universities here, I'm in the UK right now, are complaining that because of Brexit, they're cut off from the EU kind of science collaborations. When Iraqi science was strong in the 70s and 80s, it was largely because they were a part of international collaborations. And so you have to have a system. We can't think that, science can just be indigenous or that it can just be international. It has to be both. And so I think that certain efforts have been done that are quite good. I think Doctors Without Borders, their program, so MSF, their program in Iraq, or at least one of them, has really, they've put the time into developing a sort of network of Mosul-based researchers through a microbiology laboratory that are doing high-level monitoring of certain kinds of health problems that are related to environmental degradation and environmental pollution, such as antimicrobial resistance. In a perfect world, MSF would be doing that program with the University of Mosul, and that institutional capacity would be implanted within a kind of institution that will be there for many years to come. But at the very least, they're working with a localized network that's producing high quality research, and that network is there. I can call up these people, I know them, and if I want to know something about what's happening in Mosul with AMR, I have people to talk to who are all Iraqi and are all excellent researchers, as in part because of this international collaboration. So I really think you need, though, because the international community has so many humanitarian specialists who kind of come in and out and don't really know anything and don't really have any kind of actual scientific capacity and knowledge. What you need actually is partnerships with universities and research-oriented kinds of institutions, MSF being one of them, because they kind of merge research and health practitioner work into one thing. So we need new international collaborations. We need to get beyond the kind of the UNs and the the USAID and kind of have a different kind of engagement, I think.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's really important to not only think of the problem, but also think of solutions and what can be done on the ground, because we know there's a problem, but what else? What happened beyond the problem? So thank you for giving us that. Maha, I want to go back to you in terms of your paper on activism. And again, activism and civil society is part of the solution, right? We talk about it as, there's crisis, what can be done? But in order for us to address what can be done on the environmental civil society sort of level, we kind of need to know a little bit about the mechanism of the oppression that are happening. We know there is a problem, and Iraqi politicians know there is a problem, and they know there is instability and conflict that can be generated from that problem. The whole political system and stability of society can be impacted by water scarcity, climate change, etc. But at the same time, state and non-state actors are targeting activists who are trying to raise awareness, who are trying to organize. Why this counterproductive behavior? Why there's an issue and your position will be under threat, and yet you arrest, threaten, kidnap activists at the same time? Why is that happening?
Thank you, Zainab. This is Maha Yasin again. The threat that is facing the civil society in Iraq in general escalated after the Tishreen movement in 2019. And of course, climate activists weren't an exception. And as you said, there are two types of threats. One that comes from non-state actors who basically frame these activists as collaborators with foreign entities against the Iraqi society values and tradition. And they run a big defamation campaign that resulted in these people being harassed, kidnapped, arrested, to the extent that some of them had to leave the country. The other threat that comes from the state itself, and this is also escalated after the establishment of the Foreign Coalition government, and the state started to monitor the effort of climate activists in general, but also the environmental civil society. So they were monitoring their movements, with whom they are collaborating. They have to submit a very transparent report on their activities, the fund that they receive, to the extent that they will also limit their access to the data. For example, if a group of activists want to run an advocacy campaign on a certain topic, and they also, at least in the South, I noticed that they sent people from the government to attend the events or the workshop that are organized by civil society. And of course, these civil society have to take a permission from the government to hold these events. And the reason, of course, is that both the state and non-state actors are doing this is to maintain their position, their political influence, to win another election. And they are doing so by basically silencing the voices that showcase their shortcomings or their failure to address the impact of climate change and environmental degradation in general.
Thank you, Maha. So really, really appreciate that kind of unpacking the mechanism for us a little bit about, again, this seems like to be a very counterproductive behavior where your position will be threatened on the long term, but at the same time, you're oppressing the folks who can stabilize or can contribute to the stabilization and addressing of the problem. So we have 5 minutes left. And in these 5 minutes, we talked about the problems, and there's a lot of problems and many layers of the problems, and it's a multi-generation, multi-year problem. And I want us to conclude on what can be done. We know there is an issue, there's a lot of research on the issue, and I want to see, given the limitation of Iraq, given the limitation of the state, the limitation of the civil society, all the existing issues are happening, there's a problem that needs to be faced. And Maha, let me go back to you. If you can give us one short-term thing and one long-term thing, whether it's a policy or goal or an idea or something that can be implemented given all the limitations, specifically in relation to the civil society question, what would that be?
So I think the first thing is that we need to strengthen the collaboration and trust building between the government actors and the civil society. Like in Iraq, we say, "Eid wahda ma تصفق." So collaboration is important, and I see this step is important and can be done with the support of international community and work as a mediator of this collaboration between both parties. And in the long term, besides, of course, expanding the fund for the civil society, we also need to identify leadership within the civil society and also the government actors who can actually drive the change on the ground, who can contribute to meaningful programs and a climate action that elevates the pressure on the most affected communities.
Thank you, Maha. Mac, you gave us some of that, insight, but if you can give us one short-term, one goal-term goal to work on, given everything.
Okay, so a long-term goal is that, within the government, there needs to be an effective monitoring and enforcement mechanism. Currently, in theory, that's supposed to be the Ministry of Environment. They're supposed to collect data on environmental pollution and write citations. They don't really have the power or the capacity to do that at the moment. But a long-term goal would be to have within the Ministry of Environment a relatively independent and relatively authoritative sort of research monitoring institute that could have the equipment, the capacity to identify sources of pollution, contamination, inform the public, write citations, and all that. Short term, because it's not going to happen anytime soon, just due to looking at the lack of governmental support and focus on this. This kind of thing can be done in piecemeal ways at the level of universities within and across Iraq. One would have to be a bit, realistic about, to what degree can this really be an effective monitoring mechanism? But at the very least, you can shed a light. You can get to a place where there's enough data to where Iraqis aren't completely in the dark about what kind of environmental contaminants are out there and how it's going to affect their health.
Thank you, Mac. Safa?
Yes, Zainab. Is there any question?
So long-term goal, short-term goal, something that can be achieved given the limitation of the Iraqi state, given the limitation of civil society and so on, specifically in relation to the issue or the angle of collective violence and environmental degradation in Iraq.
Yeah, Zainab, this is Safa Khalaf again. I think we have big issue in Iraq because this government or Iraq government doesn't have any policy or doesn't have any plan to maintain the water or to assist some solution of climate change. And for this reason, maybe the Iraqi people they will suffer a lot in upcoming years. But in the short term, maybe we need to have some collaboration between the civil society and the government or individual government or government in the cities, and also we need the obvious agreement between Baghdad and Erbil, between the government and the Kurdistan region, because I think we have now issues is more important than any conflict between Kurdistan region and Baghdad, because Kurdistan region now is preparing itself to use water as a political tool to achieve political change in the future, including the declaration of Turkish state and the political separation from Iraq. I think this is a big issue in upcoming 5 years, because until now, Kurdistan region, they doesn't use these tools as open in Baghdad. But in upcoming 5 years, Kurdistan will use it, the water as a tool in the conflict. For this reason, maybe we need to obvious agreement, clear agreement between Baghdad and Erbil, and also we need a new agreement between Baghdad and other local government in Iraq.
Thank you, Safa. Thank you so much. Hussam, in 10 seconds, short-term, long-term goal.
Thank you, Zainab. So this issue, in my point of view, and that's of many academic and researchers in this field, is not very complex. It revolves around 3 crucial aspects. Firstly, we require a rigorous Iraqi negotiator appointed by the Iraqi movement, by the Iraqi government, to ensure the rightful allocation of water resources from neighboring countries. I mean, the upstreaming countries.
5 seconds, Hussam.
Secondly, there's the need for effective internal water management. And thirdly, I think we must take a more serious approach towards addressing the consequences of climate change. I believe that adhering to the Paris Climate Agreement is one of the key considerations in this regard.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hassan. Thank you so much, everybody. That was a pleasure to have you all here with me. Thanasi, you got the floor.
Zainab, thank you, and the panelists, Hussam, Safa, Mac, and Maha. You all are doing an amazing job illuminating the real painful details of this crisis, but also the practical ways forward. And I think this is exactly a model of the kind of policy research we need to make some real sense out of what's otherwise an overwhelming crisis, and giving us a roadmap to actually do practical, achievable things to mitigate it. And I find the discussion today and the work you all have produced is a real antidote to the hopelessness that sometimes pervades the conversation about climate change. So thank you all very much for your contributions now and in the future. And thanks for joining us for today's Century International panel on Iraq's climate emergency. Thanks to the audience, and we'll see you next time.